the intro. Oh, well. If we aren't able to record, we'll just press on.
It should be recording now.
Thank you. Thank
Okay.
you.
Well, in summary, because now this is the beginning of the recording and you've left me in charge, I want to summarize that we got some really great ice cream flavors that everyone would be, and I felt very jealous of not having a call sign. That's my summary of the last 10 minutes. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you folks today about some earthquake scenarios. I'm really happy to take questions. I'll give about 15 or 20 minutes of a presentation, and then I think we have 10 minutes just for questions. So, I guess save them till the end, but I'm very happy to speak more. And of course, I'll start by saying that none of this work is done in isolation. I'm really just presenting on behalf of quite a large team, both at Natural Resources Canada, of which the GSC is a subgroup. So lots of great colleagues there that I work with, and also our colleagues at the Global Earthquake Model Foundation in Italy. So I always like to start a presentation by giving you the minimum information that I would love for you to walk away with. So if you need to let your ears and eyes glaze over for the next 15 minutes, what I do want you to take away from this is an idea of what the national risk model that we're making is really about. And so it's a neighborhood level seismic risk assessment for Canada. Neighborhood level meaning that we have our results down to a postal code level. It combines knowledge of hazard, the built environment, and socioeconomic data. So hazard in this case, talking about earthquakes. Built environment is all the buildings and the people who are in them. And socioeconomic data tells us more about maybe people's ability to withstand these kind of catastrophic events. And it allows us to understand potential impacts and develop mitigation strategies. So I'll be presenting kind of on that national risk model because I think that that's the kind of tool that hopefully empowers folks like you to have a better understanding of what you can expect after an earthquake happens, and what might be the sort of, I work a lot with emergency managers to say, here's what's going to be happening for you. So hopefully it's helpful to you folks as well. So the National Seismic Risk Profile has kind of two branches. We have a probabilistic branch, and probabilistic here means that we take every earthquake that could ever occur and kind of statistically average out over some time horizon what's the likely amount of seismicity. Or we have our earthquake scenario catalog. So that's where we take just one earthquake at a time and we sort of really develop a narrative for that event and say, if this particular event of this magnitude in this location happened, what's going to follow? And for either branch, we're able to report on metrics of the physical risk, which includes things like the building performance, public safety, economic security, and social disruption, as well as the strain on social fabric. So things like shelter, individual autonomy, financial agency, and family structure, because we know that all of those things will affect the differential way that we experience disasters. So just a little bit of background on seismic risk, because I would venture to guess that you folks are interested in technical details. So when we use the term seismic risk, what we're talking about is really at this intersection of exposure, hazard, and fragility, where exposure refers to the buildings and the people who are in them. That's so the assets that are exposed. Hazard refers to the earthquake shaking or the probability of some earthquake shaking over a certain time horizon. And then fragility refers to the likelihood of those assets being impacted to some certain extent by the hazard. So you can sort of think of it like the Three Little Pigs, where you had the hazard in that case is the wolf, and then the exposure would refer to the different buildings that they were in, the like straw, wood, and brick. And the fragility would tell us that the straw house was quite weak, so it was very fragile, whereas the brick house was the strong one, so it was the least fragile. And the risk is really the intersection of all those. So if you had, 3 pigs in a brick house, then even though you have 3 pigs exposed to the hazard of the wolf, your risk is quite small because the fragility is low. So it's that sort of trade-off when we're talking about the risk. And here in Canada, when we're talking about seismic risk, this is kind of a schematic picture of what we're talking about and how we go about modeling it, where the hazard here is described by some earthquake rupture that occurs at some location. And then we have mathematical equations called ground motion prediction equations that relate the rupture at the source to the shaking at the site. And then we have some measure of the site response, because we know that if there's thick sediments, then it's going to tend to amplify the waves of the earthquake. So it's sort of, you can picture it like if you have thick sediments, it's like you're on a bowl of jello. And then we have an inventory of different buildings, which we call our exposure model. And then our fragility model is specifically developed for Canada to relate our certain buildings to what amount of damage would happen for different levels of shaking. We have our colleagues in Ottawa who produce the National Seismic Hazard Map, which is sort of the starting point of all of our work in the seismic risk team. So I won't go too much deeper into the kind of technical details of how we do the modeling, but I wanted to cover sort of what are the outputs in terms of an example, because like I said, we have our outputs are available at the neighborhood level. So for every postal code, we could tell you what's the impact from each earthquake or from, the likely amount of shaking over a horizon. We would also be able to tie that back to information about the number of people, the year of construction of the buildings, the types of construction, and then we can report on a lot of different indicators. So I think an example is a really much more helpful way to kind of understand. So I'm going to use a case study of a magnitude 9 Cascadia event. In Vancouver, we know that this is the sort of big one that we talk about a lot. When I say magnitude 9, I'm referring to the moment magnitude, which is the sort of modern, most scientifically rigorous kind of magnitude that we talk about. We know that the really strong shaking from this event would last about 2 minutes, although the total shaking for it might be more like 5 or 6 minutes. We expect that the strongest shaking would be about 45% of G, or free fall. So you can think of that as if you're on a roller coaster and you're in that moment of drop, about half of that sensation is the maximum acceleration you would feel during this earthquake if you were located in communities along the west coast of Vancouver Island. We expect to see a tsunami of some sort generated by an earthquake like this. We expect to see liquefaction and landsliding. Landsliding we're all kind of familiar with, but liquefaction, for those who maybe it's an unfamiliar term, it refers to when you have saturated soils and the shaking from the earthquake actually causes the pore pressure to increase and it causes the soil to behave like a liquid for some period of time. So it was really impactful in the 2011 Christchurch earthquake, where they had to replace 50% of their roads just from liquefaction alone. Not very deadly, but very disruptive of infrastructure and roads. We expect to see aftershocks that continue for years. And for this event, we expect tens of billions of dollars in damage. And that's just from damage to buildings alone. So now kind of really digging into some of these impacts that I'm talking about, or outputs from our model. What I'm showing here is a map of the hospitalized casualties that would require hospitalization from this earthquake scenario. So that's what the colors on this map are showing, and I'm plotting them by the census division, which is sort of like a metro area. So unsurprisingly, we see that we have the largest numbers of hospitalizations in our metro areas of Greater Vancouver, Victoria, and Nanaimo. Over here, I'm just showing a total and breaking it down and including some other types of casualty severities. So we expect to see about 35,000 people in Southwest BC who would require some type of first aid for the injuries they have. We expect to see another 11,000 who would require hospitalization or hospital care in a non-critical way. About 1,700 who would require critical hospital care, or more like ICU beds. And then we have about 3,400 people who, would unfortunately maybe be killed during the earthquake itself or become entrapped and seriously endangered inside of their buildings. We can also break this down. As I said, it's at the neighborhood level. So that's what I'm showing here. This is effectively a postal code map of a large portion of Vancouver, Richmond, Delta, Surrey, New Westminster. and I'm plotting the density of minor injuries. And so what I think this kind of helps us to see are some of the patterns of which areas are likely to experience a lot of injuries. And, you know, the patterns that kind of stick out to me are some of these low-lying industrial areas, like in parts of North Van, along the river and in the Delta and near the airport. And then another pocket here in this kind of low-lying area near Olympic Village. And these trends, I mean, I'm showing you for minor injuries, but they tend to hold for kind of lots of types of damage. Now I'm showing the fatalities and entrapments. I suppose now understanding better that you folks are just based in Vancouver, this is not the most relevant, but this is for Victoria. And so once again, this is the kind of map that I actually prepared this map originally for a heavy urban search and rescue group. To sort of help them think about which areas do we expect to have to be sending people to if we have to, let's say, make decisions before we have aerial reconnaissance available. If we look at the number of disrupted people that we would expect for this Cascadia earthquake, this is, again, breaking it down by the census division, and we're looking at 90 days from the event, 180, and 360. And so unsurprisingly, we're still seeing those metro areas really driving the risk for our region, where Vancouver has over 300,000 people being displaced or disrupted from their housing at 90 days out. Victoria has about 93,000. And then as we go forward, even a year out, we still have upwards of 40 or 50,000 people who are disrupted from their housing. If we look at the, what I'm plotting here are the number of fatalities if this event were to happen in the day. And I've broken it down by the different construction types. So we have concrete, steel, reinforced masonry, unreinforced masonry, precast concrete, wood, and mobile homes. And I've broken down the number of fatalities by these different construction types. So, you know, we can sort of start to get at some of these drivers of risk. We can see that, of course, concrete and steel, not of course, but after looking at this, it's quite clear that, of course, those are two of our main drivers of risk and our two biggest sort of problems for life safety. And then we can actually further break that down. So these colors within each bar are showing the individual subtypes within those major construction groups. So here we could see that C2L, for example, are low-rise concrete shear wall buildings, and they account for over 200 scenario fatalities. So that's sort of interesting because we might think that shear wall buildings, they're, first of all, concrete shear wall is very common in Vancouver, and a low-rise building we tend to maybe be a little bit less worried about because it's a smaller building. So to see that that's still a significant contributor is very important information for people who are maybe thinking about retrofits. Same with RM1L, that's reinforced masonry with a wooden metal diaphragm. And again, you know, we're used to thinking about unreinforced masonry as being a problem, but we can see that even reinforced masonry is still driving our risk pretty significantly. Now I'm showing the same chart, only I'm breaking it down by the occupancy type. So here COM refers to commercial occupancy types. So businesses, you know, basically most things that aren't residential, industry, or some specialty group. And so we can see that that's really driving, again, it's quite clear from this one chart even that our commercially zoned buildings are really driving up our risk quite appreciably. And, you know, of course, it's startling then to see that the second runner-up is EDU1, which is K through 12 schools. We also do have the ability maybe to break away from only the doom and gloom and to use our tool for looking at potential options to mitigate some of this risk. So what I'm showing you here instead is the same chart, only now I've done a fake scenario where every building has been retrofitted, which is unrealistic, but it helps to show us like where do we have the opportunity to make really big improvements. And so we can see that, you know, across both concrete and steel and reinforced masonry, we have the ability to drive down risk if we can pick out which buildings are we most concerned about, you know, that best align with our goals. So that's sort of what I'm getting at here with this flexibility. If we decide that life safety is one of our main concerns, then we have the ability with this model to say, well, here's the buildings that are really an issue for in terms of life safety. And so maybe those are the ones that we target. We can also combine that with some spatial mapping so that, let's say, if you know a certain roadway is going to be important for emergency responders, we know that fire trucks and ambulances use Kingsway, for example. It's a major thoroughfare that goes directly through the city. It's also historically the road that the city was built on. So we have a lot of older buildings that were developed before we had stringent seismic codes. So perhaps that's an area where we could look at it and say, well, we have a lot of commercially zoned concrete shear wall and reinforced masonry buildings along Kingsway, and we know that Kingsway is going to be important for our disaster response. So those are the kinds of buildings that we're going to invest our money in. So I wanted to highlight just kind of a few high-level trends that maybe weren't shown already, because I think these kinds of things might be important for you folks who are going to be the responders or helping the response. So the majority of our building stock across Canada overall is wood. I think it's about 85% of the national building stock. And we know that wood performs pretty well in an earthquake, but it still suffers damage. So whenever we run these models, we see ubiquitous light damage in wood. And kind of the one thing that runs counter to that idea that wood is pretty safe is actually basements with wood structural elements. So if you have a concrete basement and then the concrete only goes a foot or two above ground level and the rest of that basement floor is filled in with a wood framing, and then all the rest of your stories above are, you know, maybe 10-foot stories, and that one's about 4 feet tall, let's say, to fill in the rest of the basement. That short wall tends to locate all of the damage in the earthquake. So we see in California, for example, where wood frame buildings are like totally intact, but they're like have collapsed in on that cribble wall, or maybe have just popped right off their foundation. And those are the kinds of things that are, you know, relatively easy to retrofit. It's maybe, you know, it's not very disruptive. It might be a few $1,000s, and you could, you know, save a lot of these wood buildings. So that's the kind of thing that I always like to point out, especially here in Vancouver. As I said, we know a lot of our fatalities are coming from concrete, steel, and masonry. As I said, the majority of our high-rise buildings in Canada are concrete, and the majority of those concrete high-rises are concrete shear wall. In Christchurch, that earthquake in 2011 in New Zealand, the majority of the fatalities came from only a few collapses. I think there were 2 buildings that completely collapsed or mostly collapsed, and that drove pretty much all of the fatalities. And so I think it's important when we think about an earthquake scenario in Vancouver that it's likely going to be similar, where there might be a few collapses that will be really high sites of fatalities and damage. And so accordingly, we can expect to see cordoned off areas, likely in the downtown West End, some of these commercial areas near rivers, maybe the downtown East Side. We know that hospitals will likely be damaged. Here in Vancouver, St. Paul's is one that, you know, quickly comes to mind as being an unreinforced masonry pre-code building that we are relying on for having, in some ways, relying on to have a post-earthquake role. So that's maybe something to keep in mind until the new one gets built. We know that debris is likely to block roadways to at least some degree. So I think a lot of first responders I talk to who are saying like, oh, we're going to be out in our trucks. And it's, I think, important to have conversations about what will the response be if you're not able to drive. Same with, you know, a lot of people say we're going to get on our phones, and I'm so happy to get to talk to you folks, because my question is always, well, what if your phones aren't working? And that's, you know, where you guys come in. And then finally, I always like to highlight that marginalized people will have the least ability to cope and self-rescue, especially when they're living in susceptible buildings already. So the downtown East Side is, of course, a sort of unfortunately perfect example of that, where historically that is a part of town where Vancouver was kind of built from there. So we have a lot of historical buildings or old buildings, but now they tend to be occupied by mostly people who may already be on the fringes of society. And we know that those people are going to be the most vulnerable in a disaster. So in case I went quickly, or in case you guys are interested to explore more about these earthquake scenarios, we are currently developing a website that's going to be called riskprofiler.ca. That's going to be designed for non-experts to be able to go in and explore more about earthquake scenarios and earthquake risk overall, and kind of take a place-based look and say, what's the area that's important to me and what more can I learn about it? There'll be downloads and guidelines, and I think it'll be a great resource. So that'll probably be available in early 2022. I'll throw this up for a minute. It's being recorded, so you guys will have access to these, but if you'd like any more information, you're free to reach out to us. And with that, I'll just say a big thank you again for having me, and happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Dr. Hobbs, Tiegan. That was quite a tour. I've got a couple of questions off the bat, and it's like, I guess it depends on risk profiler, but would we be able to look up the damage map for Vancouver, like the one you showed for Victoria?
Yes, like I could make that and send it. Ideally, I'm trying to get all of these results online. So probably by this summer, the results will be available in like a table format, like a Excel or CSV, so that if you have folks who maybe have some skills with mapping, then, or just an interest in this, by this summer you should be able to go and pull the data yourself and take a look and explore. And then, yeah, probably Risk Profiler would be the sustainable way to do that for your group by early next year. Yeah.
Thank you. So that would be in the GitHub part of the.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So before others have, does anyone have a new question for Tiegan?
I do have a question for Tiegan. Hi, Tiegan. What a great presentation. Thank you so much. My name's Russell. I had a couple of quick questions. There's a lot of increasing proposals by developers in Vancouver to build residential condos and low-rise towers using wood. Presumably, in my mind, concrete construction is more expensive, but if done right, provides far more survivability. Is there any truth to that, or am I on glue?
First, thank you for the kind words. So I am not a structural engineer, so I don't want to speak beyond my expertise. But what I could report from sort of my findings and from working with some of the engineers who are exploring that question, I would say, yeah, I think there's work right now that's really going into better understanding how to make sure that our wood construction is not only survivable, but resilient. So it's definitely a question that earthquake engineers and structural engineers are working on. My sense from having run a lot of these models is that if survivability is your #1 goal, then wood is a great option across the board, just in terms of, so, just even at sort of a kind of like, without being a structural engineer, we know that wood is quite elastic. And so generally when it deforms, it can deform a much larger amount and still snap back into place. Whereas concrete, the amount that it can deform before it fails entirely is much lower. And so we like the idea of wood buildings, I would say, from a seismic perspective. It's just these certain kinds of these like cripple wall buildings where you have, which again, were all mostly built before we knew that we even had earthquakes here. Because, historically, we didn't know we could get large earthquakes in Vancouver until about the early 90s. So yeah, so there's some problematic wood here, but generally wood is a good choice. And there are people who are trying to answer your exact question.
Thank you, Tiegan.
Yeah, thanks for the question.
Does anyone else have a question? Because I have a follow-on related to wood structures.
Yeah, Jesse, if you don't mind, I'll ask. Got a terrible camera here. Hi Tiegan, thanks for that, Stuart here. Yeah, similar to Russell's question, well, I was under the impression that some of these newer modern concrete and steel buildings were really quite safe. Now I'm starting to have my doubts about that, and quite glad that I have a wood structure building around me right now. Do they build some of these more modern buildings, do you know? I know you're not a structural engineer, but do they build them with this in mind and have any kind of escape routes, shelter in place plans so that they can kind of accommodate that risk?
Yeah, that's a great question. And maybe I think I should be clear that when I'm saying, I have a slide that I actually took out of this deck that looks at that same chart of, contribution to fatalities by the different construction materials. And then it breaks it down by code level. So basically, depending on when a building was built, it would have had a different building code that it had to be designed to. And so anything built before about the 60s or 70s, we call a pre-code building, in that there was basically no code, no seismic code that it had to be designed to. So when we talk about our contribution to fatalities, I have this perfect chart that basically shows that it's all pre-code buildings. If you're in a recently, if you're in a building that's designed since about 2005, I would say that's generally speaking, you should have an expectation that you will walk out of your building unscathed after an earthquake, other than if you have bookshelves that are going to fall on you and stuff like that, but that the structure itself is going to be designed to a high level of code that considers the kinds of earthquakes that we have, the kind of rare earthquakes that might happen, especially if you're in a building that's expected to have a post-earthquake functionality. Then they even have a stricter code that they have to build to. So yes, new buildings, you should feel pretty confident about. And yeah, it's really just these older buildings. And so in some way that's nice, because we know that those are likely to be torn down and replaced over the next, couple of decades or even less. So yeah, I don't mean to throw all of concrete, steel, and masonry under the bus. Unreinforced masonry is not great, but the other three, if you're in a newer building, they're going to have taken a thoughtful approach to how to do that in a seismically responsible way.
Okay, yeah, so just a quick follow-up, unless you've already answered this. Are they more likely to be able to go back into their building, the say, a commercial building made of concrete and steel, as compared to somebody who's living in a wood-structured building?
So all of it will depend on the severity of the damage. So generally speaking, if you're in a wood frame building that does not suffer, for example, if you were in a wood frame building where the frame has been bolted to the foundation, and where if you do have that cripple wall situation, so that bit of wood in your basement, there are ways that you can actually just add planks of wood. And again, not as an engineer, but just from talking with them a lot, you add planks of wood and there's a certain nailing pattern even that you can use that helps the wood become more resilient. So there's a lot of great ways to make even old wood buildings safe, that you will be walking out and perhaps able to just walk back in and only conduct minor repairs on your building, which is why I think wood is a great option if you want to see a big reduction of your financial risk. So wood can be totally fine. Concrete, I think, again, if you're in a 1950s concrete building, I don't want to scare anyone, but those are the kinds of buildings that we feel concerned about, I think, within our community, especially the high-rise buildings, because they're much more arduous to try to retrofit because, it's a much larger structure. You have to think about, or from talking to engineers, they're thinking, well, how am I going to basically make a new structural system for this building and then attach the old structure to it? So it's just much more complex. But it's not to say that any steel building is a bad choice and any wood building is a good or bad choice. I think a lot of it's going to come down to the age of the building, whether or not there have been retrofits carried out. And then again, as I sort of only mentioned briefly, it also depends on where your building is. For example, the earthquakes in, I think it was 1981, and then recently in 2017 or 18 in Mexico City. Mexico City is built on an old lake. So it's this really thick package of sediments that thins up towards the end, sort of like in Seattle. Anyway, so it's houses were, there were big changes in the amount of damage that happened just based on how thick the sediments were in that basin when the earthquake waves hit.
That's great. Thanks very much, Tiegan. Yeah, I think I'm going to have a think about doing some work on my house, my wood framed
Oh.
house, and maybe see if I can have a word with the insurance company to get maybe some rebates or some discounts too. Thanks very much for that.
Stoked to hear it.
Yeah, because related to that, building codes they tend to be done for just to keep the building standing long enough so you can escape. So I guess the inspection is a big deal.
Yeah, and that'll be that's another area that I think will be quite stressful when an earthquake happens, that just trying to inspect all these buildings will be like, it's a really appreciable task to have qualified people to do those inspections, even just to tell you whether or not you can go back into your building.
So that means that every single building will need to be inspected, or is there kind of like a triage where you can kind of not inspect some?
Like, to be totally honest, I don't really know or understand. My sense would be that like, my sense is that a lot of people will make a choice about their own building. That if, you're in a building and there's nothing wrong with it and you just see like some little cracks, then you're gonna just occupy your building. And I think in theory, like emergency management or Be Prepared, or I'm forgetting the name of the group that like teaches preparedness. They have those different color signs you put up in your window if you're okay or not. So I'm guessing there will end up being a lot of buildings that maybe don't get inspected because there is clearly no damage. And perhaps likewise, there will be some buildings that don't get inspected because there's clearly too much damage. But it'll be those buildings in the middle that, or also like, yeah, sorry, I'm just like kind of nerding out now, but like in some places where we have a better sense of how people respond to earthquakes because we have earthquakes, then like they can make formulas for how many people will stay in their buildings at some certain level of damage. And here, like we thought about trying to come up with how to do those, and it was really unclear because no one here has experienced an earthquake. So folks who maybe are coming from, let's say like Central or South America, where they might have felt earthquakes before, would have a different reaction. Whereas Canadians, like as someone who grew up in Vancouver and who works in this field, like, I don't know if I'll stay in my building or not, like whether or not, which type of damage and what psychology will go into it. It's, yeah, I think an interesting question.
I think I want to squeeze two more questions in. The first one is, when you mentioned ubiquitous light damage, would that be the stuff that still needs repair work? Or is that stuff that you could actually live in?
Yeah, when I refer to ubiquitous light damage, it's livable. We have kind of like 4 levels of damage, and the first 2 you can live in, and one is maybe like aesthetic damage that you can choose if you get it fixed or not. The second is sort of like, in sweeping terms, like damage that you probably should get repaired, but you can still live in it. And then the next is like, you can't live in that house permanently, or maybe you can only live in part of it permanently, and the rest you're going to have to like cordon off within your own house. And then the highest level of damage is where you cannot reoccupy that building in any way. Maybe part of it has collapsed. Yeah.
Wow. Thank you. And is there another question?
Yes, I have a question, Jesse. Richard here. Very good talk, Tiegan. Thanks very much. Is there this software program risk profiler? Well, then, and there's been a lot of questions about how to upgrade and stuff like that. Will there be information in there to point people towards making decisions as to maybe they look further if you're in a wood house or something like that, or what to look for if you're looking for a house, stuff like that, from the engineering side point of view?
That's a great question. I know that we're planning to have resources for, like, let's say a community planner, or maybe an emergency manager about how to use that tool. I think we're not totally sure how to handle an average homeowner or tenant or citizen in that context, because I think our goal would be to help people understand what's the risk for a structure like theirs in an area that they're in, and then sort of direct them to a more appropriate agency or resource to make some of those decisions about what should I actually do with that. So it's kind of like a weird government mandate thing where our mandate is not to help people be prepared. So we can't give advice on that. And like, frankly, I probably have overstepped even in this talk. And then, you know, we don't want to give engineering advice about what should you do for your house. And so I think our goal will be to really just provide our mandate has been described as like we're the evidence, we're the scientific support for decision makers. We are not the decision makers. So I think we'll take the same approach when it comes to helping citizens be empowered to make the right choices for their own situations.
Yeah, I don't expect to, you know, get a universal source of information, but just where to point fingers, who to talk to next, you know, what questions to ask, that kind of thing. I think would be helpful to people. I'm sure they're, you know, they're going to come out. So, but anyway, yeah, hopefully they'll put something like that in there. Thanks very much.
Oh, no, thank you. Great feedback too.
There's 2 small questions from Hassan. I think we could, if you're up to it, we could stretch the time a little. So Hassan's first question relates to, go Hassan.
Hi, I'd just like to know, with all the wood buildings in the Lower Mainland, if we had a subduction type earthquake, what is the likelihood of major fires that would displace people?
It's a great question. So there's a fellow named Charlie Scawthorne who just recently did a study in Vancouver looking at that exact question of fire following an earthquake. And I think that take home sort of that I got for at a very high level is that I think he ended up modeling like a similar amount of financial impact from the fires as there was from the earthquake itself for some of the scenarios he was looking at. So I think in summary, you know, I would point you to that paper. If you look up Scawthorne Vancouver fire, hopefully it would come up. And I'll type the name in the chat. Yeah, I think the summary is that there is likely to be fire following an earthquake. It does seem to depend a lot on things like what's the weather, what's the wind direction, how closely spaced are the houses, what's the availability of fire personnel or fire equipment. Are the water mains disrupted, let's say by liquefaction? I think there's a lot of questions, but the take home I got was, yes, we can expect to see fire following. That will be an appreciable amount.
Liz here, just to add, when we looked at the New Zealand fires versus what we have here, New Zealand doesn't have natural gas and we do. So there's potential for fire due to the natural gas lines breaking.
Yeah, definitely.
I have a follow-up question. Also, in a subduction earthquake, what's the risk of low-lying areas around Vancouver and Metro Vancouver being damaged in any way by a tsunami?
So again, I don't want to overrepresent areas outside my expertise. I'm not a tsunami modeler, but the sense I get from talking to tsunami modelers is that generally for a subduction earthquake, we expect to see a pretty small tsunami in Vancouver area where it might be, you know, less than a meter or 2, I believe is what some of the models predict. There are ways to model, to generate scenarios where the model shows us a larger tsunami in Vancouver. If say you had a smaller earthquake closer to Vancouver, like in the Strait of Georgia, that's, you know, a thing that could happen. Also, if you had a subduction earthquake that, or any kind of earthquake that would loose landslide materials that flow into a body of water, that can create localized tsunamis that can be really, you know, appreciable in amplitude and super hard to predict because they, you know, it's just like, where's a landslide going to happen and what's across the water from it. So I don't want to underrepresent the risk that tsunamis could occur, but most of our models show us that for a subduction zone type event, it's really the west coast of Vancouver Island that is dealing with a lot of the tsunami risk, and Vancouver is at a relatively lower risk. That said, anytime you feel, the rule I believe is if you feel shaking that is strong and long, then go to higher ground. And, you know, probably not the worst advice to know.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the great questions.
Thank you, Dr. Hobbs. I want to ask about the tsunami modelers and if there's any in Vancouver, but I'll set that aside. And thank you again on behalf of everyone for sharing the last 45 minutes with us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It was really a treat. And thank you folks for the great work that you do in operating the amateur radio network. So thanks.
So our time is 1920.